In this section, we'll consider higher brain functions such as sleep, memory, cognition, emotion, sensation, motor control, and language. These functions involve interactions between the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Many of these functions can be seen in multiple areas of the brain, so the brain does not have easily defined anatomical boundaries. The integrative functions of the brain focus mainly on the cerebrum, but involves combined action at multiple brain levels. For research and clinical applications, it's common to monitor the electrical activity of the brain waves on the surface of the head. It's useful for studying normal brain functions such as sleep and consciousness, and in diagnosis of degenerative brain diseases, metabolic abnormalities, and brain tumors. The brain waves are rhythmic voltage changes that result from synchronized postsynaptic potentials at the superficial layer of the cerebral cortex. There are 4 general types that are distinguished by their amplitude and frequency. They're alpha, beta, theta, and delta waves. The persistent absence of brain waves is a common clinical and legal criterion of brain death. Alpha waves are about 8 to 13 hertz. They're the normal waves that we see when we're awake but resting, with the eyes closed and the mind wandering. The alpha waves are suppressed when we open our eyes and perform a mental task, at which point they would change to beta waves. Beta waves have a higher frequency. Our eyes are open, we're performing mental tasks, or we're responding to sensory stimulation. Theta waves are found in drowsy or sleeping adults. They're much slower than alpha waves. When we see theta waves in an awake individual, it could be an indication that they're under emotional stress. Now, delta waves are high amplitude waves, but very low frequency. We find them in very deep sleep in adults. However, if delta waves are seen in an awake adult, it's indication of some severe brain damage. Sleep is probably the human function that's most commonly studied with the aid of EEGs, both for scientific understanding and diagnosis of sleep disorders. Sleep occurs in cycles called circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are events that reoccur at intervals every 24 hours. Sleep itself is a temporary state of unconsciousness from which one can be awakened when stimulated. So it's different than coma or hibernation, because in either of those cases, stimulus will not awake the individual. Sleep is characterized by a stereotyped posture, usually lying down with the eyes closed. When we're asleep, we experience sleep paralysis, which is inhibition of muscular activity. Basically, so we don't act out our dreams and damage someone that may be sleeping next to us. Some individuals experience this sleep paralysis upon awakening, and it can be really a frightening experience. Now, we may wonder why we even need to sleep, and that is one of the big questions. It's possible that sleep has a restorative effect. Brain glycogen and ATP levels increase when people are in non-REM sleep. So when we're in REM sleep, perhaps the glycogen and ATP levels are restored to normal levels. It may be suggested that sleep is about promoting synaptic connections and reinforcing memories that have been created during the day. There are 4 stages of sleep. This is an image of one sleep cycle. There are 4 different stages in each sleep cycle. In stage 1, we feel drowsy, we close our eyes and begin to relax. We often feel a drifting sensation and are easily awakened if stimulated. Alpha waves still dominate this stage of sleep. However, in stage 2, we pass into light sleep. The EEG declines in frequency but increases in amplitude. We start seeing sleep spindles, which are high spikes that result from interactions between neurons of the thalamus and cerebral cortex. During stage 3, we're considered to be in moderate or deep sleep. This occurs about 20 minutes after we enter stage 1. At this time, theta and delta waves appear. The muscles relax and the vital signs will fall. That includes body temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate. Stage 4 is also called slow wave sleep. The EEG is dominated by low-frequency, high-amplitude delta waves. Muscles are now very relaxed, vital signs are at their lowest, and we become very difficult to awaken. Again, here's a graphical representation of the 4 different stages of sleep. Now, we may go through this cycle about 5 times a night. This is when a sleeper backtracks from stage 3 or 4 to stage 2. When we get back to stage 2, we exhibit bouts of rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, where the eyes oscillate back and forth behind the eyelids. It's also called paradoxical sleep because the EEG resembles the waking state, but the sleeper is harder to arouse than they are in any other stage. That's a paradox. Vital signs increase during REM sleep, and the brain uses more oxygen than it does even when it's awake, so it's very busy. Sleep paralysis becomes stronger, perhaps to prevent the sleeper from acting out their dreams. Dreams can occur in both REM and non-REM sleep. However, the dreams that we experience during REM sleep tend to be longer, more vivid, and more emotional. The parasympathetic system is also very active during REM sleep. It causes constriction of the pupils and erection of penises and clitorises. The erection that men experience during their REM sleep has very little to do with sexual dreams. In fact, maybe only 12% of their dreams are sexual in nature, even with an erection. This rhythm of sleep is controlled by complex interactions between the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the reticular formation. Arousal can be induced in the upper reticular formation, near the junction of the pons and the midbrain. Sleep can be induced by nuclei below the pons and in the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus in the hypothalamus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus is also important as a sleep center. It's located above the optic chiasm. Input from the eye allows the SCN to synchronize multiple body rhythms with the external rhythms of night and day, such as sleep, body temperature, urine production, secretion, and many other functions. Again, sleep probably has a restorative effect. Deep sleep deprivation can be fatal to experimental animals, so we do know that sleep is necessary. However, it's still really a big mystery as to why we sleep. This could be another great topic for consideration in a final project. We know that bed rest alone doesn't have a restorative effect. So why is it we have to lose consciousness? It may be a time to replenish the energy sources that I referred to earlier, and it may consolidate and strengthen our memories by reinforcing some synapses and eliminating others, thus deleting memories that are not necessary. Cognition is the range of mental processes by which we acquire and use knowledge, such as sensory perception, thought, reasoning, judgment, memory, imagination, and intuition. There are association areas in the cerebral cortex that have each of these above functions and constitute about 75% of all brain tissue. Studies of patients with brain lesions, cancer, stroke, and trauma yield this information on cognition. There's a parietal lobe association area that's involved in perceiving stimuli. If patients have lesions in the parietal lobe, they seem to be unaware of objects on the opposite side of their body. This is called contralateral neglect syndrome. They may not even know where one arm is relative to the position of their body. That is, they lose proprioceptive capabilities. The temporal lobe association area seems to be involved in identifying stimuli. Patients with lesions in this lobe have an inability to recognize, identify, and name very familiar objects. This is called agnosia. When this happens in the recognition of people, it is called prosopagnosia. The frontal lobe association area seems to be involved in planning our responses and personality. Lesions here result in an individual's inability to execute appropriate behavior. We can see this in the accident of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was working on a railroad and ended up with a spike all the way through his head. However, he lived, but his behavior changed dramatically. The injury was to the ventromedial region of both frontal lobes. As was said earlier, these prefrontal lobes are involved in planning, moral judgment, and emotional control. He became very fitful, irreverent, grossly profane, which was completely opposite of his previous personality. The prefrontal cortex is of particular interest to me because we do have the capacity to modulate and moderate each of these functions of the prefrontal cortex. I think this is where yoga and neuroscience seem to converge for me. Now, memory is one of the cognitive functions, but warrants a little bit more special attention. We've studied it before from the perspective of its neural and molecular mechanisms. Now, we're going to consider where these processes occur anatomically. The subject, though, is really a little broader than memory, per se. It's more about information management. The brain entails learning, which is acquiring new information. Memory proper, information storage and recall, as well as forgetting or eliminating trivial information. This is just as important as remembering. People with a pathological inability to forget trivial information have a big difficulty in reading comprehensions and other functions that require us to separate what's important from what's not. More often, though, brain-injured people are either unable to store new information, which is anterograde amnesia, or to recall things they knew before the injury, retrograde amnesia. Amnesia in general refers to defects in declarative memory, such as the ability to describe the past events, not procedural memory, such as the ability to tie your shoes. The hippocampus of the limbic system is important in memory formation. It doesn't store memories itself, but it organizes the sensory and cognitive information into unified long-term memory. It can also teach the cerebral cortex until a long-term memory is established. This is called memory consolidation. Long-term memories are stored in various areas of the cerebral cortex. Vocabulary and memory of familiar faces, for example, is stored in the superior temporal lobe, whereas memories of one's plans and social roles is stored in the prefrontal cortex. The cerebellum helps us learn motor skills, and the amygdala helps us learn emotional memories. So emotional feelings and memories result from interactions between the prefrontal cortex and the diencephalon. The prefrontal cortex, remember, is the seat of judgment, intent, and control over expression of emotions. Feelings seem to come from the hypothalamus and the amygdala, where the nuclei generate feelings of either fear or love. There's really only two options. This is one of the yogic principles, but it's really exhibited by the physical structure of the brain also. The amygdala is a major component of the limbic system. It receives processed information from the general senses and from vision, hearing, taste, and smell. This input enables it to mediate emotional responses to such stimuli, like, for example, a disgusting odor or a foul taste, or maybe something beautiful or painful. It's especially important in the sense of fear, but also plays roles in food intake, sexual behavior, and drawing attention to novel stimuli. Output from the amygdala goes in two directions of special interest. Some goes to the hypothalamus and the lower brainstem and influences somatic and visceral motor system. This is why an emotional response to a stimulus can actually raise blood pressure, cause your heart to race, and make your hair stand on end, and sometimes even induce vomiting. The other output goes to areas of the prefrontal cortex that mediate conscious control and expression of emotions, such as the ability to express love or control anger or overcome fear. Behaviors are shaped by learned associations between stimuli, our responses to them, and the reward or punishment that results. Now, we can't help the actual stimuli that are coming in, but it's very powerful to understand that we can alter the response to these stimuli. For example, let's say you're holding a long yoga posture and it becomes painful. The pain is just a label that we've given to a sensation. We can choose how to respond. Simply bringing a smile to your face and breathing in the face of difficulty can allow us to respond in a different way. We don't have to process that painful stimulus as pain. It can simply be sensation. And indeed, a great deal of the cerebrum is concerned with sensation. Most of the cortex of the insula and the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. The regions that are called the primary sensory cortex are the sites where sensory input is first received and one becomes conscious of the stimulus. Adjacent to these are association areas where the sensory information is interpreted. For example, the primary visual cortex receives input from the eyes, and it's broadened by the visual association area, which interprets and makes cognitive sense of the visual stimuli. Some areas process information from many sources. These are called multimodal association areas. They integrate the information into an overall perception of the surroundings. Here are some of the functional regions of the cerebral cortex. You should perhaps become familiar with the motor association area, certainly the primary motor cortex and the primary somasthetic cortex or sensory cortex, and the association area. We'll see Broca's area, we'll explore Wernicke's area, we'll explore the auditory association areas and olfactory association areas here shortly. So special senses are limited to the head and employ relatively complex sense organs. We'll be exploring each of these special senses in a following chapter. They include vision, hearing, equilibrium, taste, and smell. The general senses, however, are distributed over the entire body and employ relatively simple receptors. They include such senses as touch, pressure, stretch, movement, heat, cold, and pain. The thalamus will process the input and selectively relay signals to the postcentral gyrus, or the primary somatosensory area. We can see this gyrus here. This diagram shows that receptors in the lower limb project to the superior and medial parts of the gyrus of the opposite side, and receptors in the face project to the inferior and lateral parts. This point-to-point correspondence between areas of the body and areas in the central nervous system is called somatotropy. This diagram of the primary somatosthetic cortex, which resembles an upside-down sensory map of the contralateral side of the body, is called a sensory homunculus. Homunculus simply means little person. The intention to contract muscle begins in the motor association area, or the premotor area of the frontal lobes. We have a plan of our behavior. When neurons compile a program for degree and sequence of muscle contraction required for a particular action, this program is transmitted to neurons of the precentral gyrus, or the primary motor area. Most of the precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. It's this blue one here. The precentral gyrus also exhibits somatotopy. Neurons for toe movement are deep in the longitudinal fissure on the medial side of the gyrus. The summit of the gyrus controls the trunk, shoulder, and arm, and the inferiolateral region controls the facial muscles. So it's pyramidal cells in the precentral gyrus that are the upper motor neurons. These fibers project caudally. About 19 million of them end in the nuclei of the brainstem, and about 1 million form the corticospinal tracts. Most fibers decussate in the lower medulla and form the lateral corticospinal tracts on each side of the spinal cord. In the brainstem or spinal cord, the fibers of the upper motor neurons will synapse with lower motor neurons, whose axons innervate the skeletal muscles. The basal nuclei and the cerebellum are also important to muscle control. The basal nuclei determine the onset and cessation of the intentional movements. Repetitive hip and shoulder movements in walking are examples of this. These are highly practiced, learned behaviors that one carries out with very little thought, like writing, typing, driving a car. Once we're used to the behavior, we don't think about each and every step. There is a feedback circuit between the cerebrum and the basal nuclei and to the thalamus and back of the cerebrum. Movement disorders caused by lesions in the basal nuclei are called dyskinesias. The cerebellum is important in motor coordination. It aids in learning motor skills and maintains muscle tone and posture. It smooths the muscle contractions so they're not all jerky and coordinates eye and body movements so that the eyes move with the body while still tracking objects. People with lesions in the cerebellum will sometimes exhibit clumsy or awkward gaits called ataxia. Now, language includes several different abilities: reading, writing, speaking, and understanding words, and it's assigned to different regions of the cerebral cortex. This is where we'll look at Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Wernicke's area permits recognition of spoken and written language and creates a plan for the speech. When we intend to speak, Wernicke area formulates phrases according to the learned rules of grammar and transmits the plan of speech to Broca's area. Broca's area then generates a motor program for the muscles of the larynx, tongue, cheek, and lips, and transmits that program to the primary motor cortex so that it can command the lower motor neurons that supply the relevant muscles. If there are lesions in the affective language area, it produces a flat, emotionless speech called eprosody. Here are the language centers again. Broca's area up here in the frontal cortex, and Wernicke's area over here. Aphasia is any language deficit from lesions in the same hemisphere, usually the left, because that's where Wernicke and Broca's areas are. Non-fluent aphasia, or Broca's aphasia, is from a lesion in the Broca's area. If you think about the function of the Broca's area, we'll see that slow speech and difficulty in choosing words or using words that only approximate the correct words are symptoms. In Wernicke's aphasia, or fluent aphasia, we've got a lesion in Wernicke's area, and so the speech is normal and excessive, but uses jargon that makes little sense. And individuals cannot comprehend written and spoken words. Anomic aphasia. In the condition of anomic aphasia, the individual can speak normally and understand speech, but cannot identify written words or pictures. Cerebral lateralization is the difference in structure of function of each of the cerebral hemispheres. Usually, the left hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere. It specializes in spoken and written language and sequential and analytical reasoning like math and science, sort of like linear processing. It breaks information into fragments and analyzes it in a linear way. The right hemisphere is generally the representational hemisphere. It perceives information in a more integrated and holistic way. It's the seat of imagination and insight, musical and artistic skills. It has a great perception for patterns and spatial relationship, as well as comparison of sight, sound, smells, and taste. In this figure, we can see, in general, what the left and right hemispheres might be responsible for. This is the situation for most individuals. However, in some individuals, the right hemisphere is more the categorical, linear processor, and the left hemisphere is more representational or parallel processing. It's highly correlated with handedness. The left hemisphere is the categorical one in 98% of right-handed people. And left-handed people, the right hemisphere is categorical in 15% and the left in 70%. This lateralization develops with age. Males exhibit much more lateralization than females and suffer more functional loss when one hemisphere is damaged. So that brings us to the end of our section on integrative functions in the brain. Spend some time reviewing this material before you move on. Next, we'll go into the cranial nerves. You'll really want to